A very common question we get about the CMA exams is which part should you take first? Do you need to take part 1 before you can take part 2? Do they need to be taken in order? And if they don't need to be taken in order, which part should be taken first? Well, to answer the first part of this question, no, the two parts do not need to be taken in order. You can take part 2 before you take part 1 if you want. So the question then becomes, which part should you take first? Well, what I recommend is you do this. First, you'll look at the detailed learning outcome statements and look at what is on each of the 2 exams. If you look at each of those 2 exams and you're going through your mind and you think, wow, this part is a lot easier. I'm more familiar with this, I have more experience with this, but wow, this part seems easier to me, then that's the part you start with. Start with the part of the exam that you think will be easier for you to prepare for and to pass. If you look at both parts and you don't determine that part 2 is easier than part 1, then if they're equal, go ahead and start with part 1. The 2 exams do not really build on each other, so it really doesn't matter which part you start with. Start with the part that you think is going to be easier for you. Now, what happens is most people prefer to start with part 1, and I think a lot of people start with part 1 without even thinking about it. They just say, oh, it's part 1, I'll take part 1 and then I'll take part 2. But if you think part 2 is going to be easier, then you can go ahead and start with part 2 and take part 1 after you pass part 2. Now, a connected question to this is that people see that the part 2 pass rate is a little bit higher than the part 1 pass rate, and so they think that part 2 is easier and ask, is part 2 easier than part 1? Well, I think this is a very personal question. And for each person, it might be different based on your experience, your background, what topics you find interesting, what topics you don't find interesting. I believe that the main reason that the part 2 pass rate is higher than the part 1 pass rate has nothing to do with the difficulty of the 2 exams. Rather, because most people start with part 1, the people who fail part 1 and choose not to continue never take part 2. But most of the people who take part 2 have already passed part 1. And so the reason that the part 2 pass rate is higher is not because part 2 is easier, but because the people who are taking part 2 have kind of self-selected, and they're the people that passed part 1, and the people that failed part 1 once, twice, or 3 times, those people that failed part 1 a lot never get to part 2, and so those people are not bringing down the part 2 pass rate. So, to summarize all of this, which part should you take first? Take the part that you think is easier for you. Look at the syllabus, look at the detailed learning outcome statements, and determine whether or not you think part 1 or part 2 would be easier for you to prepare for, and take the part that you think is going to be easier to prepare for. If you can't decide, if they look equal to you, then go ahead and start with part 1. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to pass part 1 and you're going to have to pass part 2. So go ahead, make the process a little bit easier by starting with the part that you think is easier for you to pass.